So for percent decrease, it's when your value goes down by a certain percentage. So you figure out the percentage first and then subtract it off the original amount. So if you wanted to find out what was 10% decrease off of $20, well, we know from yesterday that 10%, we can do that by just moving the decimal place 1 over. So 10% of 20 is 2, and then you would subtract $2 off of 20, and you would get $18. So that would be a percent decrease. So here's our first example. What would the final price for a $20 item be if it were decreased by 30%? So we start by figuring out, okay, here we got 30% is 0.3. And remember that 30% of something, we want to figure out 30% of $20. Then you change your percentage to a decimal, so 30% would be 0.3. And then remember that of means that we're going to multiply. So 0.3 times 20, go to our calculator and get 6. Right, so if it's going to be decreased by 30%, that means $6 is going to come off of that, and you're going to get $20 minus 6 leaves you with $14. So the final price would be $14 if it was decreased by 30%. And how do you see that in a store? They have a big sign that says 30% off. So that means you take 30% of $20, find out that that's $6, and that's how much money would come off of the original price, and you would only have to pay $14. So here's one for you to try. Original price was $35. Now it's 40% off. Figure out what the final price would be. Okay, let's see how you guys did. So first, we want to figure out what is 40% of 35. So we change 40% to a decimal. That would be 0.4. Multiply it by 35. And do you use a calculator? Is that what you got? So 14. So now we have to take $14 off of 35 because we're going to decrease it by that, and our final price, $21. Were any of you trying to do the mental math way that we learned the other day? Where we do, what is 10% of 35? 350. So 40% would be 350, 350, 350, 350.
I realized that it was very close to 50%, so I just divided 35 to initially 10% off of that.
Okay, good. Excellent. Now, one of the things that we saw when we did percent increase, so I'm going to go back to what we were doing when we did percent increase. Remember, we did this way and then added it, and I said, well, you could also do percent increase by multiplying by 1.25. So if you want to increase something by 25%, basically what happened is we started with 1 and added the 25%, which is 0.25. And then that gave us a shortcut for figuring out percent increase. So if you wanted to increase by 25%, you could take your 40 and multiply by 1.25, and that would give you the final price right away, instead of first figuring out that 25% of 40 was 10 and then adding it to get 50. And one of the places where this comes in really handy is when you're doing things with taxes. So if you wanted to add 13% taxes, notice we took 1 and then added 0.13, the 13%, and multiplied by 1.13 to get our final price with taxes, and that gave it right away. There's a similar shortcut with percent decrease. what you do for percent decrease, if you want to decrease something by 30%, you would have to take 1 and minus your 30%. In other words, if 30% is taken off, how much is left? 70%. Does that make sense? So if you were to take 0.7, which is 70% of the original price, times by 20, you will get the final price right away. So for me, for mental math, sometimes it's easier to do 10% than it is to do 90%. And there'll be different times where that comes in. If you wanted to find out what a 10% off is, I would probably do what we did on the left here, because 10% is easy to figure out, and then subtracting it's not hard. But if someone said they would like to take 90% off, if you ever got a sale that said all items are 90% off, that's a good deal. And then that would mean that you're only paying for 10% of the original price. Then the shortcut way here, when you do 1 minus 0.9, would leave you just with 0.1, and then you could figure it out that way. So here in this second example, 40% off. Well, if you take 40% off, you're left with 60% is left. And if you did that directly, 60% times 35, you would get $21 right away. So on these questions, when I ask you on a quiz whether you're doing a percent increase or a percent decrease, I'm going to let you choose. You can choose if you would like to do the shortcut and say, well, when it's 40% off, that means it's 60% of the original price. You can do it directly that way. Or if you'd like to calculate what 40% is first and then subtract it off, you can do it that way as well. So you can choose either of those methods.